The year is 1857, a year that would become etched in the annals of Indian history as a turning point, a year when the simmering discontent against the British East India Company erupted into a full-blown rebellion. The discontent had been brewing for years, fueled by the oppressive policies and exploitative practices of the British East India Company. The sepoys, Indian soldiers in the company's army, were the first to rise in revolt. Their mutiny was not just a military rebellion, it was a cry for justice, a demand for respect and dignity. From the sepoys of Meerut to the Rani of Jhansi, the rebellion spread like wildfire. It was not just a fight of a few soldiers, it was a collective uprising of Hindus and Muslims, princes and peasants, united in their struggle against a common enemy. They stood shoulder to shoulder, transcending religious and regional differences, united by a shared sense of injustice and a common goal of freedom. This uprising, often referred to as the First War of Indian Independence, was a testament to the shared destiny of a people yearning for self-determination. It was a moment of unprecedented unity, a glimpse of what a united India could achieve. The rebellion, though ultimately crushed by the superior might of the British forces, planted the seeds of unity and nationalism. The brutal suppression of the revolt left a deep scar, but it also ignited a flame of resistance that would burn for decades to come. It showed the potential for a united India, a nation where people of different faiths and backgrounds could come together for a common cause. It was a moment when religious differences were set aside for a larger cause, a moment when the bonds of brotherhood and solidarity were stronger than the forces of division. However, this spirit of unity would face severe challenges in the coming decades. The British, wary of the power of a united Indian populace, would employ a strategy of divide and rule, sowing seeds of discord and mistrust among different communities. The 1857 revolt was a watershed moment in Indian history. It was a powerful demonstration of the potential of Hindu-Muslim unity, a potential that the British were determined to undermine. The rebellion demonstrated the power of unity, the strength that comes from standing together against oppression. It was a lesson that would resonate through the years, inspiring future generations of freedom fighters. The rebellion was a direct response to the oppressive policies of the British East India Company, policies that had impoverished the land, exploited its people, and disrespected their traditions and beliefs. It was a fight for freedom and self-determination, a fight to reclaim dignity and justice. The sepoys, along with countless other Indians, took up arms not just for themselves but for the future of their country. Though the revolt ultimately failed, it laid the foundation for the Indian independence movement. It was a precursor to the larger struggle that would eventually lead to India's freedom in 1947. The revolt showed that the British were not invincible. It exposed the vulnerabilities of the colonial regime and demonstrated that the Indian people were capable of challenging their oppressors. The memory of the 1857 revolt would continue to inspire generations of Indians. It became a symbol of resistance, a reminder of the sacrifices made by those who fought for freedom. The shared sacrifices made during the revolt created a sense of camaraderie and solidarity among the Indian people. It was a bond forged in the crucible of struggle, a bond that would endure despite the challenges ahead. Hindus and Muslims fought shoulder to shoulder, recognizing that their strength lay in their unity. They understood that their common enemy was the colonial power that sought to divide and rule them. They recognized their common enemy and stood together in their fight for freedom. It was a powerful message of unity and resistance. They yearned for a free and independent India, a nation where they could determine their own destiny. This shared struggle could have been the bedrock for a united and harmonious nation. However, the British had other plans. The British, determined to maintain their grip on power, would use a cunning strategy of divide and rule. They exploited the divisions within Indian society, pitting communities against each other. They sought to maintain their grip on power by any means necessary, even if it meant tearing apart the fabric of Indian society. They would use a cunning strategy of divide and rule, manipulating leaders and exploiting existing tensions to keep the Indian people divided and subjugated. And this strategy would have devastating consequences for the future of India. The seeds of division sown by the British would eventually lead to the partition of India in 1947, a traumatic event that would leave deep scars on the nation's psyche. The 1857 revolt was a missed opportunity for Hindu-Muslim unity. It showed the potential for a united India, but also highlighted the fragility of that unity in the face of external manipulation. The British were quick to exploit the divisions within Indian society. They understood that a divided India was easier to control and manipulate. They sowed the seeds of discord and mistrust, creating an environment of suspicion and hostility that would plague India for years to come. This would ultimately lead to the partition of India, a tragic event that resulted in the displacement of millions and the loss of countless lives. The legacy of the 1857 revolt is a complex one. It is a story of both hope and heartbreak, of unity and division. It is a reminder of the potential for unity, but also of the fragility of that unity in the face of external manipulation. It is a reminder of both the potential and the fragility of Hindu-Muslim unity. The revolt of 1857 remains a powerful symbol of what can be achieved when people come together for a common cause, and a cautionary tale of what can happen when they are divided. Following the 1857 revolt, the British adopted a new strategy. They realized that their previous methods of direct control and suppression were not sustainable in the long run. The revolt had shown them the strength and potential of a united Indian front, and this realization led them to rethink their approach to governance in India. They realized the potential of a united India. A united India could challenge their authority and threaten their colonial rule. Therefore, they needed a way to weaken this unity and ensure that the Indian people remained divided and easier to control. To maintain control, they decided to sow seeds of discord. They began to devise policies that would create divisions among the Indian population, making it difficult for them to unite against the British. This was the beginning of their infamous divide and rule policy. The British used propaganda to emphasize the differences between various communities in India, particularly focusing on religious differences between Hindus and Muslims. The British began to portray Hindus and Muslims as separate entities. They encouraged the idea that these two communities had fundamentally different interests and could not coexist peacefully. They highlighted religious differences and downplayed shared cultural and historical bonds. By doing so, they aimed to create a sense of mistrust and animosity between the two communities. This policy manifested in various ways. One of the most significant methods was through the administrative tools at their disposal. The census, for instance, began to classify people based on religion. This was a deliberate move to create a sense of separate identities among the Indian population. This further solidified religious identities. Over time, people began to see themselves primarily through the lens of their religious affiliation, rather than as part of a larger Indian identity. Separate electorates were introduced, pitting Hindus and Muslims against each other for political representation. This move ensured that political power was fragmented and that no single group could challenge British authority effectively. Educational policies were skewed, promoting narratives that emphasized differences rather than commonalities. The British-controlled education system taught history and social studies in a way that highlighted divisions and minimized the shared heritage of the Indian people. The British also exploited existing fault lines within Indian society. They were adept at identifying and magnifying social, economic, and cultural differences to keep the population divided. They provided preferential treatment to certain communities. By favoring one group over another, they created a sense of competition and resentment among different sections of society. This created resentment and mistrust among different religious groups. The British policies fostered an environment where suspicion and hostility could easily take root. The divide and rule policy was a cynical ploy to maintain power. It was a calculated strategy to weaken the Indian resistance by ensuring that the people were too divided to mount a united front. It was a betrayal of the shared history and sacrifices of the Indian people. The British exploited the very fabric of Indian society to serve their colonial interests. The impact of this policy was devastating. It led to deep-seated divisions that would have long-lasting consequences for the Indian subcontinent. It led to the rise of communalism. The seeds of division planted by the British grew into a pervasive culture of communal tension and conflict. This poison began to seep into the social fabric of India. Communities that had lived together for centuries began to view each other with suspicion and hostility. It manifested in the form of riots, mistrust, and suspicion. The British policy of divide and rule had succeeded in creating a fractured society. The seeds of division sown by the British would eventually bear bitter fruit. The divisions they created would have far-reaching and tragic consequences. This would culminate in the horrors of partition. The subcontinent was torn apart, leading to one of the largest and most tragic mass migrations in history, with millions displaced and countless lives lost. As the 19th century gave way to the 20th, a new and dangerous idea began to take root. This idea would eventually reshape the destiny of millions and alter the course of history in the Indian subcontinent. The two-nation theory gained traction, particularly among some Muslim intellectuals and leaders. It was a theory that proposed a fundamental division within the Indian society, This theory posited that Hindus and Muslims were two distinct nations. It suggested that their differences were not just religious but extended to every aspect of life. They had different cultures, traditions, and aspirations. The proponents of this theory argued that these differences were so profound that they could not be reconciled. It argued that they could not coexist peacefully within a single nation state. This idea was both radical and controversial, sparking intense debates and discussions. Proponents of this theory pointed to differences in religion, language, and customs. They highlighted the distinctiveness of Muslim and Hindu ways of life. They argued that these differences were irreconcilable. They believed that the cultural and religious divide was too wide to bridge. They believed that Muslims would always be a minority in a Hindu-majority India. This minority status they feared would lead to perpetual marginalization. They feared that their rights and interests would be marginalized. This fear was not unfounded, as historical grievances and contemporary politics often sideline minority voices. This fear was further fueled by the British policy of divide and rule. The British colonial administration often played communities against each other to maintain control. The two-nation theory found fertile ground in the increasingly polarized political climate. The political landscape of the time was marked by growing tensions and divisions. The rise of Hindu nationalism, with its emphasis on Hindu identity and culture, further alienated some Muslims. This movement often portrayed India as a fundamentally Hindu nation. They saw it as a threat to their own identity and way of life. The fear of losing their cultural and religious identity drove many Muslims to support the two-nation theory. The two-nation theory, while initially a fringe idea, gradually gained momentum. Leaders like Muhammad Ali Jinnah began to champion the cause, giving it a powerful voice. It provided the ideological framework for the demand for a separate Muslim state. The idea of Pakistan began to take shape, driven by the belief that Muslims needed their own nation to protect their rights and interests. This idea, however, was a fundamental misreading of Indian history and society. India had always been a land of diversity, where multiple cultures and religions coexisted. It ignored the centuries of shared culture, language, and traditions. The rich tapestry of Indian society was woven with threads from all its communities. It disregarded the countless examples of Hindu-Muslim unity and coexistence. From shared festivals to joint struggles for independence, the history of India was replete with instances of collaboration and mutual respect. The two-nation theory was a dangerous and divisive ideology. It sowed seeds of discord and mistrust, leading to a fractured society. It would have tragic consequences for the Indian subcontinent. The partition of 1947 led to one of the largest mass migrations in history, accompanied by unprecedented violence and loss of life. The scars of this division are still felt today, a testament to the enduring impact of the two-nation theory.